I was not supposed to be home before dusk. The pilot rode an unexpected tailwind into Logan. The driver skipped the tunnel, and I found myself back on the North Shore with an hour I hadn't counted on. An extra, unearned hour that felt like a gift. The parcel in my handbag, an antique fountain pen in lapis enamel I'd hunted down for weeks, clicked against my phone with each step. Richard loved old instruments of any kind. He said the weight of a pen could steady a mind. I am Eleanor Hart, 66, and I do not often hurry. Am Y second husband, Richard Hale. Believe the weight of a pen could steady a mind. I believe the weight of a promise should steady a life. But that afternoon the air off the water was brisk, the tide pushing against the rocks below our terrace with the hush of a theater audience before the lights rise. And I wanted to surprise my husband at the close of his board call. Our place stands on a bluff north of Boston, salt-whitened shingles, deep eaves, windows that remember every storm. Thomas, my first husband, chose the lot and insisted on the windbreak pines. After he was gone, I learned the pines were not just for weather. They were for privacy. They were for sanctuary. The side gate yielded when I pressed my shoulder to it. The brass latch had a particular throat-clearing sound when it settled. The gardeners joke that even our hardware has good manners. I lifted the latch with 2 fingers to keep it silent. A surprise is a delicate thing. Once startled, it bolts. The back door was resting on the bolt, not drawn tight. That was unusual. Our housekeeper, Maria, locks a room even to answer a kettle. I told myself it was a moment's distraction. A delivery, perhaps a service call. I stepped into the mudroom, the faint perfume of lemon oil and old cedar rising from the built-in benches. My coat went over my arm instead of the hook. I kept my shoes on the rug, quiet, careful. Voices were moving through the lower level. The way voices move when people stand to leave and then sit back down to say one more dangerous thing. I recognized Richard's cadence first, that veneered calm he uses for investors and unpleasant cousins. Then a tenor that does not belong to my house and never has, Evan, his son. And a woman's voice that pulled a thread of something tight in my chest. Lena, his daughter. The children of my husband's first marriage, both in their 30s, hungry in ways that fine schools cannot feed. IT is a strange skill to hear without seeming to hear. When you have chaired as many meetings and survived as many condolences as I have, you learn to stand behind a half-open door as if it were a mirror, not a wall. I stood, and the house, my house, the one Thomas built, held me up. It's straightforward, Evan was saying, eager. Too loud in the kitchen's high ceiling. You let her keep the ceremony, the photo ops with the foundation. But the voting rights slide to the family office. Temporary on paper. 8 weeks at most. By the time she notices, we've consolidated and optics will be clean. Lena's reply came on a silk thread. She trusts you, Dad. She signs whatever you place in front of her if it's wrapped in the word legacy. And we need the endowment now, before the quarter closes. Our lenders aren't sentimental. Our lenders, not mine. I understood then that what they wanted was not my blessing. It was my signature. Not my company, Hart and Bray Holdings, though it would follow, but the Hart Foundation, the Hart Thomas left me to keep beating. The endowment itself is an echoing number, most of it locked in a trust that funds scholarships, clinics, roofs that do not leak. But a majority vote, 52%, can open any vault if a lawyer with the right appetite holds the key to Richard's voice, closer to the doorway, threaded between theirs. She's not naive, Lena. She's methodical. We do this in stages, nothing messy. Estate planning, an interim proxy for health reasons. For health. Lena laughed once, a gleaming sound. She came back from that checkup with a gait like a dancer. If we wait, Dad, we lose the bridge financing. Then the magazine piece runs. You know what happens after that. Doors close. I could see them without looking. Richard in his navy half-zip, tall, almost boyish when he didn't have to perform. Evan in a blazer that cared too much. Lena with her beautiful eyes and the patience of a cat. Richard's hand would be around a glass of water he hadn't touched. He always holds something when he is about to drop something else. When do you plan to tell her? Evan again. Before or after she signs the proxy. If you want my advice. I don't, Richard cut in, soft but final. Let me manage the tone. Eleanor appreciates straight lines and clean paperwork. We keep it civil. Eleanor appreciates straight lines. I felt a very old part of me lift its chin. Thomas used to say that civility is a suit of armor you can wear to dinner. It does not dull the blade, it directs it. The pen in my handbag kissed my phone one more time, and the click was like a metronome in an empty hall. I turned away from the kitchen door and retraced my steps to the mudroom, the gate, the drift of rosemary in the garden bed. The tide had crept up a stone or two. The ocean does not consult us about its schedule. Outside the hedges, the wind came clean and cool. I sat in the back seat of the car and asked Daniel, our driver, to take me into town. No, not the club. The library. He looked at me in the rear view, saw what he needed to see, and drove without commentary. There are kinds of loyalty that do not ask questions. Thomas hired Daniel 23 years ago. I do not forget the math. The public library is an old brick dowager that has outlived every trend. I like its reading room because grief does not echo there. It settles. I chose a corner table beneath a portrait of a woman in a high collar who looks as if she never indulged a fool. Not even once. The light was kind, the kind that tells the truth without placing blame, that I called my daughter first. Grace picked up on the second ring, even though she was due to chair a community meeting. Mom, are you back already? You sound present, I said. I'm fine. You don't call me from rooms with that much quiet when you're fine. Some children inherit their mother's eyes. Grace inherited my silences. I need you to pull the foundation bylaws, I said. Everything on interim proxies, guardianship, emergency delegation. And the trust instrument, current version only, not the draft we tabled last spring. Call Avery when you have them. Now. Now. She did not ask why. Michael, she said instead, meaning her brother. Him after Avery, I said. And Grace, no texts. No email. Show me paper. Paper it is. I ended the call and, for one suspended breath, allowed the world to tilt. Then I set it back on its axis the way you set a picture frame straight with 2 fingers. Avery Lynn, our general counsel, answers cheerfully when she doesn't know yet that the house is on fire. Eleanor, how's the knee? Dependable, I said. Avery, I require a frost-proof strategy. Assume I must protect the foundation, the company, and my name from any attempt to shift voting control under the cover of kindness. Assume family tends to be the most complicated word in any contract. Her brightness sharpened. Understood. I'll come to you. No. Meet me at my office in the city in 2 hours. Have our archivist bring original instruments, not scans. Bring a notary we trust and 2 paralegals who can run on black coffee. Should I be worried? I prefer you precise, I said, and discreet. When I hung up, a teenager with a stack of textbooks asked if the seat beside me was taken. I smiled and moved my handbag. The satchel felt heavy, the pen inside it absurdly graceful. Gifts do not always find their moment. Sometimes they must wait until after the storm, that I read nothing in that reading room. I watched the way people carry their attention. Some gather it in both hands, some spill it like coins. And I thought about Thomas at the dedication of the pediatric wing when he whispered, "We build so the light has a place to land." I have known many kinds of love. The durable kind is not loud. It is a long, steady labor. When the hours slipped past, I texted Daniel to take me into Boston. The city office sits high enough that the harbor looks like a drawing of itself. I keep my own key because there are days when even a kind receptionist is too much. The suite smelled of old paper and clean glass. I turned on one lamp only. The light gathered itself and stayed close. Grace arrived with a banker's box and a thermos she knows I will actually drink from. She does not look like me except in the ways that count. Composture, eyes that do not sharpen until necessary. Behind her came Avery with a messenger case, the notary, and two assistants who already had sticky notes on their sleeves like battle flags. We worked without heat. Avery laid out statutes and options. Grace found clauses by instinct. I initialed where I needed to and drew neat lines through language that had sounded compassionate the day it was drafted and now read like a trap. We filed a protective notice with the Attorney General's Charities Division. We lodged a temporary firewall at the transfer agent so no voting authority could travel without two wet signatures, mine and the independent chair's. We refreshed the healthcare directive in case someone decided I needed a rest. There is a particular calm that belongs to a well-run crisis. The room had it. Pens moved. Paper whispered. No one raised a voice. It was the opposite of drama and twice as decisive. When at last we paused, the sky had gone from bright to pewter. I poured tea from Grace's thermos and let the steam soften the air. My hands did not shake. I have been through worse, I told my pulse, and it agreed. Do we warn him? Grace asked, meaning Richard, not naming him as if a name might invite him in. Or do we let him find the locks when he tries the doors? We let the locks do their work, I said. Courtesy later. Clarity first. Avery zipped her case. There's one more thing, she said gently. You could move the endowment's emergency oversight to a 3-person committee for 90 days. Yourself, the independent chair, and an outside fiduciary. It's unusual, but the bylaws allow it when there's the appearance of conflict. Appearance, I said, tasting the word. Yes. Let's spare everyone the performance. Grace reached across the table and touched my wrist, careful. Daughter to mother, but also officer to chair. How are you? Tempered, I said, and very much awake. The elevator carried them down in twos, and the office exhaled. I stood at the window until the harbor lights came up like tiny steady vows. The city does not stop for a private difficulty. I take comfort in that. Only then did I allow myself to open the little velvet-lined case and lift the pen. It lay in my palm with the gravity of a keepsake and the promise of a signature. I turned it so the enamel caught the lamplight. Not tonight, I told it softly, and I placed it back in its nest. When I stepped into the corridor, the echo of my footsteps surprised me. How certain they sounded. I have spent years preparing other people for rain. I did not realize until then how ready I was to carry my own umbrella into the storm. I texted Daniel. Home. Pleased that on the drive back, we passed a florist's window where someone had arranged white lilies with winter berries. A pairing Thomas would have called too bold until he saw it in a room and conceded it was exactly right. I smiled at the memory, not tender, not sad, merely true. A life, if you're careful, is a ledger of truths you refuse to abandon. Ate the gate. The pines whispered the way they do when weather is changing. I knew better than to read omens. Still, I lifted my face to the branches and listened. The house waited. It knows how to keep a secret until the moment comes to speak. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow we begin politely, and then, if necessary, not politely at all. Morning came with a deceptive gentleness. The sea beyond my window was still, drawn flat by a light mist. I brewed tea from a tin Thomas, once kept in his study, its label worn smooth. Habit makes survivors of us all. We perform the same rituals, even when the meaning has shifted. The house was quiet, too quiet for a home that claimed 3 adults, 2 dogs, and an opinionated housekeeper. Richard had already left for the office. That was his pattern when something weighed on him. He chose early departures over explanations. On the marble counter lay a folded note in his careful handwriting. Breakfast meeting ran long. Back by noon. Love you. He signed it with his initials. R. Never his full name anymore. Initials are what people use when they begin rehearsing detachment. I traced the letter with my thumb, then set it aside. The dogs, 2 aging retrievers who understood moods better than people, lay by the door, heads on paws, watching me. They knew when not to ask for walks. At 10, Grace called. The documents are secured. Avery's filed the protections. It's watertight, Mom. Her voice was businesslike, but beneath it I caught the steel of quiet fury. Good, said. Now forget how angry you are. Anger wastes strategy. She exhaled slowly. What's next? We'll keep them believing I'm unaware. Politeness will be our disguise. After the call, I sat at my desk, the same one where Thomas had written his last letter to me years ago, and stared out at the gray horizon. I remembered the first time I met Richard. It was at a charity auction where he'd outbid a senator for an old violin neither of them could play. He'd looked at me then with that confident spark of men who think charm can bend reality. I mistook it for passion. He was younger than me by 12 years, but age is not the same as experience. He liked to say he admired my discipline, my ability to keep things balanced. What he never understood was that balance is not grace, it's survival. Now, in the quiet of my study, I reviewed what I knew. Their plan was precise but amateurish. Richard's children had underestimated how often paper trails speak louder than words. They would need my signature to transfer proxy rights. That meant they still believed me reachable. That belief would be their downfall. At noon, the sound of tires on gravel drew my gaze to the drive. Richard's black sedan. He entered the house with the unstudied ease of a man who assumes the world will wait for him. You're up early, he said, smiling as if yesterday had never existed. I never slept. He paused, perhaps hearing the edge in my tone, then crossed the kitchen to kiss my cheek. His cologne, that faint cedar scent, reached me a moment before he did. I let him, though the gesture felt rehearsed, a scene from an old play neither of us believed in. You should have stayed in Boston, he said. Rain's coming in tonight. I prefer my own roof when it rains. He looked at me curiously, the way a man studies a room after someone's rearranged the furniture. You sound different. Do I? Calmer, like you've decided something. I smiled faintly. I have. He laughed lightly, but I saw the flicker of doubt behind his eyes. Richard has always been a negotiator, uncomfortable with silence, terrified of not being in control of the script. Eleanor, he began, I've been meaning to talk about the foundation. The auditor suggested a few structural adjustments, purely for efficiency. I turned from the counter to face him. Efficiency for whom? He hesitated. That brief hesitation told me everything. For everyone, he said finally. You've carried so much responsibility. Maybe it's time to delegate more, give yourself space. Delegate, I repeated, tasting the word as if it were a foreign flavor. Is that what you call it? He blinked, smiled again, too wide now. You know what I mean. You deserve rest. Rest. How gently men suggest retreat when what they really mean is surrender. I let the moment hang. I'll consider it, I said evenly. After the weekend. Perhaps we can discuss it with the lawyers present. That landed like a pebble in glass. He tried to disguise the fracture with another smile. Of course. Whatever you prefer. I turned back to my tea. You should eat something, I said. Maria baked lemon bread. He sat, peeled an orange, and filled the kitchen with ordinary sounds. Knife against peel, chair leg scraping tile. But between those sounds lay a silence, so tight it could snap. When he finally left for the city, I stood by the window watching the car disappear down the drive. My reflection in the glass looked composed, almost serene. Only the eyes betrayed movement, the way tides shift beneath still water. That afternoon, I met Avery downtown again. The protective measures were holding, but she suggested an additional step, a silent audit of Hart and Bray's internal accounts. If they're borrowing against future endowment funds, she said, we'll see it in cross-ledger transfers. Do it quietly, I told her. I want them comfortable, not cautious. On my way out of the office, I passed a gallery storefront. In the window hung a photograph, a single cracked teacup on a table, sunlight catching the fracture. The caption read grace under pressure. I smiled. The universe, it seems, appreciates irony. By evening, the wind had picked up. I sat on the veranda with a shawl and the dogs at my feet. The sea moved like ink. Somewhere inside, the house sighed, old with settling, or perhaps memory shifting its weight. I took the pen from its velvet box and turned it in my fingers. Its balance was perfect, neither heavy nor delicate. Thomas had once said, "A steady hand can draw a straight line through any storm." Tomorrow I would begin drawing mine. The following week unfolded with a kind of precision that only appears accidental. Every gesture, every word I offered to Richard was measured in grams, not ounces. He believed the tide of our marriage had returned to calm, unaware that the stillness he admired was simply the pause before the undertow. At breakfast, I poured his coffee, asked about the markets, and smiled when he spoke of strategic optimism. He didn't notice how rarely I blinked. I have learned that in silence, people confess to everything except the thing that matters most. The audit Avery initiated came back with numbers that hummed of desperation. Transfers between shell accounts, private loans under subsidiaries, pledges made against assets not yet acquired. In plain English, they were drowning and calling it expansion. Hart and Bray's name was their lifeline, and they were preparing to use mine as the rope. That morning, Avery sat across from me in my office, her legal pad brimming with neat handwriting. "They've been leveraging the foundation's pending commitments as collateral," she said. "On paper it's legal, but ethically—" "Ethics don't interest them," I interrupted. "Structure does. Can we trigger a compliance review without alerting them?" She nodded. "Yes, quietly. But if they're this exposed, they'll panic the moment liquidity stalls." "Good," I said, my voice steady. "Let panic do the work reason never could." When Avery left, Grace came in, her tablet glowing with spreadsheets. "You're frighteningly calm," she said. "Calm is contagious," I told her. "Let's infect the whole board." That evening, Richard invited a few colleagues over for dinner. The pretext: to discuss potential partnerships. I knew what it really was, a show of strength for investors already sensing blood. The dining room shimmered with candlelight and well-rehearsed charm. I wore navy silk, the color Thomas once said made me look like I owned the horizon. When Richard raised a toast to family and enterprise, I smiled as if the words didn't burn. Across the table sat Lena, his daughter, elegant in the way ambition often is, beautiful but brittle. She spoke of future plans for the foundation's modernization, using phrases like digital legacy and succession continuity. Each syllable was bait, gilded with youth's arrogance. "Succession is a delicate subject," I said pleasantly, slicing my salmon. "One must choose carefully who inherits, not only the chair, but the conscience." Her smile wavered just slightly. Richard's eyes flicked toward me, wary. Evan filled his glass too quickly. The evening continued, but something unseen had tilted in the room. The guests laughed, but the laughter had a new rhythm, cautious offbeat. They felt the fault line before it cracked. Later, when everyone had gone, Richard approached me by the fireplace. "That remark at dinner," he began, "about conscience, was that meant for Lena?" I looked up at him. "If it was, do you think she understood it?" He exhaled sharply. "Eleanor, you're making things harder than they need to be. We're on the same side." "Are we?" "Yes," he said too quickly. "I'm trying to protect what we built." I set down my glass. "Thomas and I built this. You've been merely living in it." He stepped closer, voice dropping. "That's unfair." "Fairness," I said, "is for children and courtrooms." For a heartbeat, we stood there in the half-light, our reflections merging in the glass of the framed portrait behind him, husband and wife or predator and prey, depending on who you asked. He turned away first. That's when I knew the balance had shifted. The next day, I arrived at the foundation early and summoned a closed session with the board. The conference room was bright, overlooking the harbor, the kind of view that convinces people they're capable of ethics. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "I've discovered inconsistencies in our financial oversight. For the sake of transparency, I'm appointing an interim review committee. All authorizations beyond standard grants are frozen until further notice." Whispers flared. One director, an old ally of Richard's, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hart, will this affect the merger discussions?" "It will clarify them," I replied. By the time the meeting adjourned, the word frozen had already traveled faster than any memo. Within hours, half a dozen informal inquiries from Richard's circle reached his phone. By evening, I knew he'd heard. He came home later than usual, rain in his hair, tie askew. "You froze the foundation's accounts," he demanded, no greeting, no preamble. "I secured them," I corrected. "That's not what people are saying." Then people should choose their words more carefully. He paced the length of the kitchen, shoes tracking small, wet crescents on the floor. "Do you realize what you've done? The optics alone are the least of my concerns," I said. He stopped pacing, hands braced on the counter. "Eleanor, you're destroying us." "No, Richard. I'm preventing you from destroying me." Silence, the kind that rings. He looked at me then with a mixture of disbelief and fear. "You've changed." "Not at all," I said. "You're just seeing the part of me that doesn't need to be polite anymore." He left without another word. The door closed and the dog stirred at my feet. Outside, thunder rolled over the water, low and patient. 2 days later, Avery called with news. "We've traced the loans." His son guaranteed one with personal assets, a townhouse and partial shares in a real estate group. "If the foundation's funds don't move, their creditors will call in everything by next quarter." "Perfect," I said. "Let them feel the edge of consequence." Grace hesitated on the line. "And when they do?" "When they do," I said softly, "I'll decide whether to be merciful." That weekend, an invitation arrived in cream stationery. Richard's doing, of course. A gala to celebrate philanthropic partnerships. His last attempt to reassure the world that all was well. I held the card between my fingers. The gold lettering caught the light like irony itself. If he wanted an audience, I would give him one. I smiled, a small, quiet curve of satisfaction, and reached for my pen. The next move would be mine. The invitation lay on my desk for 2 days before I touched it again. Ivory cardstock, gold edging, the kind of opulence that tries too hard. "An evening of legacy and vision," it read, as if irony had decided to attend. I knew exactly what Richard intended. To remind the city he was still untouchable, that whispers could be silenced with champagne and light. He had always believed in appearances. He never understood that appearance without substance is a paper crown in a rainstorm. The gala wasn't a foundation event, but a partner showcase. Our freeze could shutter transfers, not someone else's stage lights. The celebration would take place at the Wentworth Grand Hotel downtown. Marble floors, chandeliers like captured constellations, a ballroom built for reputation management. I made no announcement of my attendance, but I knew Richard expected me. Men, like him, always believe the women they underestimate will still play the supporting role when the curtain rises. That evening, I dressed in deep emerald silk, understated, commanding, the color of composure. I pinned a single diamond brooch at my shoulder, a gift from Thomas on our 20th anniversary. It wasn't vanity, it was remembrance. History wears better than fashion. Grace arrived just before the car. "You don't have to go," she said, eyes searching mine. "Of course I do," I replied. "If someone insists on writing your ending, it's polite to attend the premiere." Her expression flickered between pride and concern. "You have everything you need." I touched the small silver flash drive in my clutch, the one containing every audit, every email, every proof. "Everything," is said. The Wentworth Grand glittered like an apology, all polish, no warmth. Richard stood near the stage, surrounded by benefactors and reporters. performing charm as if it were still currency. When he saw me, relief flashed across his face, followed quickly by calculation. "Eleanor," he said, crossing the floor with his well-practiced smile, "you look extraordinary." "So do you," I answered evenly. "I was worried you might not come." "And miss such a milestone? Impossible." We smiled like diplomats at a peace conference that would never hold. He guided me toward our table, where his children, Lena and Evan, were already seated. They rose with manners sharp enough to cut glass. I returned the gesture with equal precision. Politeness is the oldest form of defense. Dinner began with toasts to philanthropy, unity, and shared vision. The speeches blurred into background music. Smooth, hollow, well-rehearsed. I studied the faces around me. Benefactors pretending not to see the tremor under the surface. Journalists waiting for something quotable. When Richard took the stage, the room obeyed him with applause. He thanked the donors, praised the foundation, and spoke of new directions, built on trust and collaboration. The words slid easily off his tongue. He'd practiced them for years. And then, as if fate enjoys symmetry, he turned to me. "None of this," he said, "would exist without my wife, Eleanor Hart, a woman whose grace defines the spirit of everything we do." The spotlight swung in my direction. I felt the air shift, the collective pause before an audience senses something unscripted. Richard's gesture was meant to box me in, an illusion of unity. It almost worked. Almost. I rose. My pulse was steady, my voice deliberate. "Thank you, Richard," I said, stepping toward the stage. "You're right, legacy does define us. The choices we make, the promises we keep, they form the architecture of our names." He smiled, but there was a question in it now. "I've spent most of my life believing that integrity was its own reward," I continued, "but sometimes integrity requires proof." I turned slightly toward the audience. "If you'll indulge me, I'd like to share a brief example of transparency, the principle our partners value most." A nod to the technician was all it took. The screen behind us flickered to life. First, the ledger. Numbers and transfers, clear as winter light. Unauthorized movements between shell accounts. Then came the correspondence, emails discussing proxy signatures, schedules, contingency plans. A murmur rippled through the room. Confusion turning into realization. Richard froze beside me, smile collapsing into silence. "This isn't," he started, voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. "Accountability," I said. "It's what every organization owes its donors, and every marriage owes the truth." Another slide appeared. His daughter's correspondence, his son's agreements. A quiet, elegant demolition. The ballroom had gone utterly still. Even the waiters had stopped moving. I turned to him once more, my tone soft but unyielding. "You once told me truth was relative. Tonight, I'd like to remind you that consequences are not." For a moment, time stood perfectly still. Then came the inevitable, the hum of whispers, the flashing of phones, the sound of reputations fracturing in real time. I set the microphone down gently on the podium. "Thank you all for your attention. The board will issue an official statement tomorrow. Please enjoy the rest of your evening." And I walked off the stage. Outside, the night air was sharp and pure. Grace met me at the car, eyes bright with a question she didn't need to ask. "You did it," she whispered. "No," I said. "He did. I just provided the lighting." We drove home in silence. Behind us, the glow of the ballroom shrank into the distance until it was just another blur against the horizon. I watched it fade, my reflection faint in the window, composed, calm, free. Inside the house, the dogs met us at the door, tails thumping softly. The ordinary warmth of their greeting felt almost holy. I unpinned my brooch, laid my clutch on the table, and listened to the sea pressing against the rocks. It was quiet, completely, mercifully quiet. I climbed the stairs, paused at the landing, and looked back at the window, the faint reflection of an older woman who had finally stopped apologizing for her clarity. The papers, the scandals, the headlines, all that would come tomorrow. Tonight there was only silence, and after all the noise, silence was the truest victory. The morning after the gala, the world remembered my name. By sunrise, my phone began to vibrate. Journalists, board members, acquaintances who had long since forgotten how to pronounce gratitude. The headlines were merciless. Charity scandal shakes Boston's elite. Heart Foundation under siege. Betrayal from within. They used words like courage, truth, revelation, as if morality were entertainment. I ignored them all. Public praise, I've learned, is only another kind of noise. I brewed tea, fed the dogs, and watched the sea climb over the rocks in a slow, gray rhythm. For the first time in months, the quiet in the house didn't feel like absence. It felt earned. Grace arrived mid-morning, papers tucked under her arm, her expression a blend of worry and restrained pride. "Michael checked in from Chicago," she said as she laid the folders down. "He'll fly in if you want him here." "Not yet," I replied. "Tell him to stay the course." Then she handed me the statement. The boards released their findings. "You're cleared. Completely. And Richard?" "Resigned. His son, too. The lenders are circling." I nodded once. "And Lena?" She disappeared, probably trying to salvage what's left of her image. I studied Grace for a moment. The precision of her posture, the calm authority she carried without realizing. "You did well." She smiled faintly. "You did better." "No," I said softly. "I just stopped pretending to sleep." By afternoon, reporters clustered outside the gate. Daniel kept the driveway clear, his presence quiet but immovable. One shouted my name, but I turned only long enough to answer. The truth doesn't need commentary. Inside, the air felt rearranged, lighter somehow, but still echoing with memory. Maria had left a tray of scones on the counter, pretending not to notice the shift in the house's pulse. She'd been with me long enough to understand when silence is its own command. Later, Avery arrived, briefcase in hand, expression sharp with efficiency. "Everything's finalized," she said, spreading documents across the table. The auditors confirmed each detail. Richard and his children are fully accountable. The foundation remains intact. I scanned the pages. My name, written clean and steady, stared back at me from every signature line. "Send them copies," I said. "No additional correspondence." She hesitated. "There's discussion about criminal charges. You could pursue them." I looked out toward the sea, slate gray under a restless sky. "No, let the law handle what it must. I'll handle the silence." "Silence," she echoed. "You can't bankrupt a man like Richard with courts," I said. "You do it with distance." Avery nodded slowly. She'd seen enough boardrooms to know I was right. When she left, I lingered in the kitchen, tracing the rim of my teacup. Victory, I've learned, doesn't taste like triumph. It tastes like calm after too much noise. 2 days later, the hospital called. The number appeared on the screen, familiar yet strange. When I answered, it was a nurse's voice, kind practiced. "Mrs. Hart? Mr. Hale was admitted last night. Cardiac event. He's stable now." For a moment, I couldn't place the words. Then instinct took over. "Which hospital?" The corridors smelled of antiseptic and fatigue. I found him in a private room. Pale beneath the white sheets, the confidence that once filled entire rooms now reduced to shallow breath. When he saw me, disbelief crossed his face. "You came." "I don't abandon what bears my name," I said. He tried to speak, voice frayed. "You destroyed everything." "No," I replied. "You did. I just refused to drown with you." He looked away, eyes dull with something between shame and exhaustion. "They're all gone," he whispered. "The company, the investors, my children." "And yet," I said quietly, "you're still breathing. That's more mercy than you ever offered me. We sat in silence, the machines murmuring like cautious witnesses. Finally, he asked, "Do you hate me?" I thought about it. No. Hatred requires energy. You've already taken enough of mine. He blinked, tears gathering at the corners of his eyes. I loved you in my way. I know, I said. That was the problem. I set a sealed envelope on the table beside his bed, a settlement check, modest but sufficient. For your care, I said. Not pity. Closure. He reached for my hand, but I stepped back. Goodbye, Richard. The nurse smiled politely as I passed, unaware she had just seen the final scene of a very quiet war. That evening, the storm finally arrived. Rain pounded the windows like applause from an audience that had overstayed its welcome. I sat in the study, lights low, the sound of the sea washing through the room. Above the mantel hung Thomas's portrait, calm, unwavering. "It's done," I said to him softly. "I kept your name clean." The words didn't sound proud. They sounded necessary. The phone rang once more. "Grace, are you all right?" "I'm something better," I said. "I'm finished." She was silent for a moment. "You deserve peace, Mom." "Peace isn't something you deserve," I said. "It's something you practice." When we hung up, I poured myself a glass of water and walked out onto the veranda. The rain had thinned to a mist. The sea was calm again, gray, infinite forgiving. I thought of Richard's face, not the man who betrayed me, but the one who once made me laugh under this same roof. Memory, I realized, doesn't erase. It simply blunts the edges until you can hold it without bleeding. I whispered into the wind, "May you learn what love costs." Then I went inside, closed the door, and let the house settle into its natural quiet. The next morning, I wrote a single-page letter to the foundation staff. Integrity is not the absence of failure, but the refusal to repeat it. Continue the work. Build carefully. Speak less than you act. I signed it, sealed it, and placed it on the boardroom table. For the first time in months, I had nowhere urgent to be. The silence wasn't empty, it was earned. I opened the windows and let the scent of salt air move through the house. Far beyond the cliffs, the tide was coming in again. This time, it sounded like forgiveness. Time does not heal, it rearranges. The weeks after Richard's collapse slipped past like unmarked pages, the kind that separate one chapter from another but carry no words. Boston thawed from winter. The sea shed its gray, and I began to relearn the sound of ordinary mornings. I kept the windows open longer now. The air carried the scent of pine and distant tide. The house, once full of echoes, had settled into a quieter rhythm. Even the retrievers seemed to walk softer, as if the weight they'd been guarding had finally lifted. Grace insisted I take some time away. "You've spent a lifetime building things," she said. "Maybe it's time to simply look at something built by someone else." Her suggestion amused me, my daughter, the strategist, arguing for idleness. But she was right. For decades, I'd measured worth by motion. Perhaps stillness, too, could be a form of work. So I drove north, along the coastline Thomas used to favor, to a small town where the sea met the cliffs without ceremony. The inn was quiet, its windows fogged by salt spray. I took the corner room with a view of the harbor and the scent of old books in the hall. The first night I couldn't sleep. The silence was so complete it pressed against my ears. I thought of Richard's last words. I loved you in my way, and felt no anger, only a faint sorrow for what could have been gentler if he'd known how to tell the truth sooner. The next morning, I walked the shoreline. The sand was cold, the tide lazy. I picked up a fragment of sea glass, edges worn smooth, once sharp enough to cut. I held it up to the light and saw my reflection fractured into colors. Maybe that's all forgiveness is, the transformation of something that once hurt into something you can hold without bleeding. 2 days into my stay, I received a letter postmarked from the city. No return address, only a neat, trembling handwriting I recognized instantly. It was from Richard. Eleanor, I've been discharged. I'm leaving the country, a quiet place, no headlines. I've signed over everything. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know, I understand now. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you stop destroying. R. I read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in the drawer of the nightstand. Not out of sentiment, but acknowledgement. Some stories don't need closure, they need distance. That evening, as I sat on the terrace overlooking the water, a familiar voice called my name. Eleanor Hart, as I live and breathe. I turned. It was Charles Weller, a former colleague of Thomas's, a retired architect who'd once sketched the first renderings of our home. Time had grayed his hair and softened his stride, but his smile was unmistakable. "Charles," I said, genuinely surprised, "you're the last ghost I expected to see here." "I could say the same," he chuckled, taking the seat beside me. "I read about the gala. Impressive, if one can call the truth impressive." "Truth is rarely impressive," I said. "Mostly inconvenient." He nodded. "Thomas used to say you had the heart of a mathematician. Precise, unforgiving, elegant." "He exaggerated," I said, though my voice softened. We talked for hours about the town, the sea, the way the world seemed both smaller and louder than it used to be. He told me he was designing again small community projects. "Something to keep my hands useful," he said. When he stood to leave, he touched my shoulder gently. "You know, you could design again, too. Not buildings, perhaps. Something else. Something that still stands after you're gone." I smiled. "I already have." Back home a week later, the days unfolded quietly. The foundation stabilized under Grace's leadership. The media, hungry for fresh scandal, moved on. My name lingered only in the background, a whisper attached to words like resilient and formidable. I preferred that to victim. I spent my mornings in the garden, pruning roses Thomas had planted decades ago. Their roots had weathered more storms than most people I knew. The act itself, the cutting, the shaping, felt like conversation. Sometimes in the evenings, I would sit on the veranda with a book and find myself smiling for no reason at all. Not joy, exactly. Something quieter, rarer. Contentment, maybe. A letter from Grace arrived one morning. Inside was a photo, her holding the foundation's new scholarship recipients. Young faces bright with beginnings. Beneath it, she'd written, "For everything you protected, thank you." I framed it and placed it on the mantel beside Thomas's portrait. Two legacies, side by side, one finished, one beginning. That night, the house felt warmer than it had in years. I brewed chamomile tea, turned off every light except one, and opened the window to the sea. The moon hung low, silvering the water. I took out my journal, a habit I'd neglected, and wrote a single sentence across the clean page. Peace is not forgetting. It's remembering without fear. I closed the book, set it aside, and let the silence fill the room. The waves moved steadily beyond the pines, the tide breathing in and out like something ancient and patient. For the first time in my life, I did not feel the need to manage it, to shape it, to win. It was enough to listen. And in that listening, in that slow, exquisite quiet, I finally understood what Thomas had meant when he said we build so the light has a place to land, because it had landed, right here, in me.